Safety in the art room using clay or in your home is very important. So let's talk about some different ways to keep you safe and your work environment safe. And I don't say any of this to scare you. People have been doing ceramics for a really long time, but you do want to take precautions so that you stay as healthy as possible. There are 3 ways that toxins can enter your system: inhalation, skin contact, and ingestion. So inhalation is the biggest thing that we need to worry about with ceramics. We never want any clay dust to be in the air. So any clay dust that's on your surface is going to end up in the air. If you touch that surface, you never want to clap your hands or have students clap their hands. Make sure that you always clean your surfaces well with a damp sponge. Don't scrape things when they're dry. Spray a surface with some water or use a wet sponge. So I even have just some scraps of clay here. I can just pick these up and then toss them in the trash. If I have some clay that's kind of stuck on here, I'm just going to clean that. You can use a bigger cleaning sponge like this, or you can use a yellow sponge. I just wouldn't use the same yellow sponge that you're using in your clay in case you have a lot of dirt or something in your surface. So this is an old ceramic sponge that I don't use with clay anymore. So I am just going to always wipe down my surface with a wet sponge or spray the surface with water. My wearboard here is quite dusty, so I'm just going to spray this and then clean it with a sponge while it's wet. And this way too, while it's wet, if I have any areas of clay that are kind of thicker, then I can kind of scrape those off when the clay is wet. Using a plastic gift card like this is a great tool for cleaning off any extra clay that is on your wearboard. So then I just need this to dry. So as you can see, sometimes the sheet that I have here will get a little bit loose, which is totally fine. And it's never going to get perfectly clean, but that's okay. This is pretty clean. If you have dry clay that's on plaster, again, never scrape that clay when it's dry. Always spray it down first and then scrape that off. A plastic card can be good for this, or I like to use a red rubber rib to clean off any extra clay. I like to clean my tools immediately after I use them. That avoids the clay drying on the tool, which will turn bone dry, and I'm trying to avoid that. Also, it's just frustrating when I pick up a tool and I'm ready to use it and it has dried clay on it. So having clean tools is definitely the way to go. Having students work on newspaper can be one way to prevent a lot of mess. They can use a canvas on the newspaper, and that way everything is kind of contained. Then when you're ready to clean up, it's easy to use the newspaper's fold to toss any scraps of clay and reuse this if needed, or just toss it in the recycle. If you do have a lot of clay crumbs on a surface, don't scrape them onto the floor, because then you would track around all that dust in your home or at school. So do the waiter trick of getting a card or a rib and scooping those crumbs into your hand and then throwing these away. You could also recycle them, but if they're just small, you can throw them away. When you're done working with clay for the day, or if your students are ready to finish up with clay in class, make sure that you wipe down the table really well with a cleaning sponge and water, or you might have some kind of cleaner that you use too. So any large sponge holds a lot of water, so it's just really easy to clean. Obviously, cleaning up any dust is good for our health, but it also is nice for the next class to have clean surfaces following ceramics class. The other important thing is don't wipe dirty clay or glaze on your clothes. So it will wash out, but you don't want those materials on your clothes to track around other places. You don't want to touch your clothes that has glaze and then touch your face. So if you do get clay or glaze on your clothes, it's totally fine. Just wipe those off with a clean sponge and rinse the sponge, and then just launder your clothes later. If you do have a lot of dirty aprons or cleaning rags or canvases, I recommend going to a laundromat to wash those all at once. You probably don't want to put those in your home washing machine with clay on them. Sometimes I will also just go outside and hose things off. So you don't want that clay going in your pipes either. You don't want to track that dirty clay or glaze around your school or your home and then touch it later, or have especially a little brother or sister touch it and then eat something. So stay clean. Another way to prevent the inhalation of dust is wearing a respirator. So if you're doing any work with mason stains or with plaster, make sure that you wear a respirator. It's best if you have good ventilation or work outside. If you're not able to work outside and you're working kind of small, I recommend using a dye box. I call this a dye box because I use this with fibers as well, but I just have a box here lined with newspaper. I spray this with water, and I have a window cut out at the top with some transparency paper so that I can see through it. But this is what I use when I am working with dyes for fibers, or if I'm working with mason stains. So I don't want any of those particulates, whether it be clay dust or whether it be the mason stains, to be airborne. Those airborne particles are what's bad for us to breathe. You may have heard something called silicosis. Silica is a main ingredient in clay, and that's what we need to be worried about. The silica particles get in your lungs and they can't go anywhere. They stay. So again, that sounds really scary, but if you do simple cleanup procedures, you will be perfectly healthy. Another thing we want to be aware of is skin contact. So this would be if you are unloading a hot kiln, make sure it's cooled to temperature. Most kilns say to wait until it's under 180 degrees. If you have to unload it and it's that hot, use heavy leather gloves. Otherwise, wait until it is room temperature and it's not an issue to touch anything. Another thing with skin contact to worry about is if you have any sharp glaze edges. So if a piece gets stuck to the kiln shelf and it's very, very sharp, you might need to take a hammer and tap that piece off of the kiln shelf. If that's the case, you should wear gloves because that glaze can be very sharp and can cut you. And you should also wear goggles when you're doing that because you don't want any piece to fly and hit your eye. The other thing to be aware of with skin contact and clay is if you have a cut on your finger or somewhere that's going to be exposed to clay or glaze materials, make sure you wear a band-aid and even a glove. If you need to throw on the wheel or your students need to throw on the wheel and they have a cut, then they will get to wear a glove to throw with, which can be super awkward, but it is really important that clay doesn't get in that cut. The next thing to talk about is ingestion. So I always label my containers clearly on the lid and on the side. It's most important to label it on the side because lids can get switched, but make sure that your students will know by looking at what you've labeled what is in the container. So I use yogurt cups in my high school classroom for slip, but my students know that that's slip. Make sure that your containers are relabeled with what is actually inside. Hopefully your students won't be eating things that they find in the art room, and it's also good for you to remember what's inside. I am really good at thinking I'll remember what I put in a container and then not knowing exactly what it is. This is pretty straightforward. It's slip, but it's always helpful to know what kind of clay because I use a few different types of clay. The last thing that's really important is electronics. So my hands are a little bit dusty. When I am finished for the day, I need to make sure my hands are super clean. I don't want to touch my laptop or my phone without having clean hands. Those clay dust particles can get into the electronics and can damage electronic devices. So I used to put my phone in my ceramic apron pocket a lot, and then my microphone stopped working because all of that dust was getting into the microphone. It was a pretty easy fix with some compressed air, but still, you don't want to have anything happen to your devices or your students' devices. Generally, my hands don't get all that dirty. We will get some clay cuticles and some clay under our fingernails. If I am throwing or if I am digging my hands in clay reclaim, then I am going to get a little bit dirtier. So if I have been touching a lot of this slimy clay, at school, you probably have sink traps, but in my house, I do not, and in other studio spaces, you may not have sink traps, so I am very, very careful to not let any clay go down my sink drains. So what I do first is kind of wipe away any extra clay that I can. This bucket is a little bit full, so this is more challenging. But then what I will do is have a rinse bucket. So I will get off most of this clay without even using the rinse bucket. And this also saves me time from recycling a lot of clay too. That was a lot of good clay that I had on my hands. So I will clean my tools in a rinse bucket, and I will clean most of my hands. Usually I get my hands a little bit even cleaner than this. Then I will use the rinse bucket to rinse my hands. If you have a sponge to help kind of clean your hands in the water, that works well too. So a couple of options for using a rinse bucket. You can, if you have a place that you think would be appropriate to throw away your clay water, like in the woods by your house, then you can do that. Another option would be to let the water get clear at the top, so the clay particles will settle to the bottom. This is called slaking, and then you can either suck up the water on the top with a big sponge, or you can like siphon it off with a turkey baster. If I just have a little bit of water in my container, then I'll just let that water evaporate and then throw away any solids. So I am getting my hands pretty clean like this, and then I'll just use a paper towel to wipe them off. And then I'll go wash my hands in the sink. So my hands are pretty clean before I hit the sink at my house. At school, I will wash my hands in our clay recycle bucket that has water in the top, and then I'll wash my hands in the sink. But I don't get my hands quite this clean at school. This is an example of a container I had water in, and I let it evaporate. The water evaporated, and then the solid clay will just come out at the bottom, and I just throw this away. You could recycle this, but there's probably a lot of dust in here, so this little amount I just toss in the trash. Safety around ceramics materials is super important. Make sure that you're taking precautions so that you're not getting clay dust into the air, which you would breathe. Clay dust is simply avoided by always cleaning with a damp sponge. Make sure that you never sand bone dry clay and you're not crushing up bone dry clay, which would create a lot of pieces and again make a lot of dust. You may hear about ceramic artists who sand their work, but they are wearing a respirator and in a facility that would have an exhaust hood. So don't do that in the classroom or at your home, because you don't want that dust to be in the air which you would breathe. So again, avoid inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact. Always wipe down tables when you're done for the day, and wash your hands really well before you touch anything. Especially, I didn't touch on this earlier, before eating. So you never want to touch clay, especially glazed materials, and then eat. So don't eat while you're glazing. Even if you stay pretty clean, always wash your hands after glazing and avoid touching your face while you're glazing. Staying safe with ceramics materials is super simple as long as you clean up really well with a sponge and water and wash your hands.